Racism. Sure, it's bad, but sometimes it's your favorite thing. Hold up, let me rephrase that. Racism is good. Dragon Ball Z is arguably the most ubiquitous anime to ever hit the United States. You might not know about Spirit Guns or the Shadow Realm, but I swear to God, if you put a beat under Gotenks' voice, you could have the whole country hitting the fusion dance at Walmart. I promise you. You just can't deny Dragon Ball's influence in the US. That anime block on Toonami changed the game for a lot of people, but the impact in the black community is beyond comprehension. Have you ever had a dude run out the house in a wave cap to ask where you got your jacket? Cause I bought a Goku Letterman on Amazon when I was drunk, and now that it happens to me daily. You can say DBZ lovers aren't real anime fans all you want, but hit me up when a bank teller wants to talk your ear off about Rurouni Kenshin or whatever it is anime connoisseurs like. Kevin. Stupid. In the hip-hop world, people talk about Dragon Ball almost as much as they talk about the general concept of money. Okay, it's really not close, but it's still a lot. Frank Ocean, Chance the Rapper, Soulja Boy. Don't even try to act stupid like RZA himself didn't write all about Dragon Ball Z and black men in America in his book, The Tao of Wu. RZA asserts that the story of the Saiyans is representative of the story of black men in America, which is something I can only partially agree with, and I'll explain why. Now, generally speaking, the exchange between black Americans and Asian culture has been a positive one, and RZA and the Wu-Tang Clan are basically human representations of that, from their extensive references to old kung fu movies in the 90s to RZA's own attempt, The Man with the Iron Fist, in 2012. Of course, on both ends of that exchange, knowledge and portrayals of the people can often be lacking, but it's not really up for debate that black Americans and Asian people are voracious consumers of each other's cultural capital. I once saw a black dude working at a ramen spot, speaking Japanese and everything, and I knew I was watching a kid living his dream. And you can see this in the explosion of kung fu movies in black communities starting in 1973 with Five Fingers of Death, the legacy of which is now carried on by who else but the king of embarrassing whack rappers, Sway Calloway, formerly of MTV News and currently of The End of Your Credibility and his own radio show, Sway in the Morning, which features the well-known freestyle challenge named after the aforementioned film. The obvious reason for this explosion is that coming off the heels of the civil rights movement, black Americans were happy to see any non-white leading man on screen, and people like Bruce Lee and stars of the blaxploitation films of the time were exactly that. And the two genres actually crossed paths on more than one occasion. At the heart of this boom was a demand for stories of oppressed people rising up and overcoming their circumstances, whether they be a rival school, a crime syndicate, or, to be honest, the Japanese, a lot of the time. Both blaxploitation and kung fu films were ultimately revenge porn for downtrodden people. And while they may not be from the same country, although Dragon Ball is based on the Chinese novel Journey to the West, his fascination with rebellion and high-speed violence in kung fu films may explain why Dragon Ball Z, the iteration that really took off in the US, was so popular among black kids when it came to Toonami in the 90s. RZA's assertion gets a little messy though when you consider that Japan doesn't exactly have a reputation for being the cultural melting pot that America likes to pretend it is. And before I move on, because I know there will be complaints, I just want to say that racism, particularly anti-blackness or dark skin bias, exists in literally every culture around the world. I won't dwell too much on the origins of that, but things like racial purity and preference for fair skin have been topics of conversation across the world for centuries, even throughout cultures a lot of us would say are black themselves, which is how you end up with Sammy Sosa looking like Pepto-Bismol's ghost. Use if you're experiencing nausea, heartburn, indigestion, upset stomach, or unfinished business. I say all this to say that there's plenty of racism throughout anime, and that Dragon Ball has never hesitated to poke fun at the very black people who've kept it in the collective consciousness since 1996. If you look at characters like Kill la Kill, you can see a version of blackness that has persisted in anime for a long time. Big lips, hulking features, and in this case, entirely unintelligible speech.
Man, I tell you that, man, entirely woke you up like a jackhammer.
Then there's Officer Black, whose name is Officer Black, stupid. He may come off as slightly more intelligent than Kill la Kill, but still has the same exaggerated features typical of black characters in anime. And he's also one of the lowest ranking officers in the Red Ribbon Army. Of course, there will be the usual naysayers who think, oh, that's not that bad, or you're overreacting, or I don't mean to be racist, but black people are just like that. And look, you're wrong, but I understand if you're not convinced just yet. Enter Mr. Popo. Anyone familiar with racial discussions around Dragon Ball could have predicted that the name was going to come up. He's been discussed extensively by DBZ fans who wonder exactly what the inspiration for his character was, because much like myself, they're looking for any evidence that he's anything other than a bananas racist depiction of a black person. That turban threw me off the scent for a while, but it could only distract me for so long before I had to accept the truth, that Mr. Popo's subtitles read exactly like the monstrous Negro dialects in Mark Twain novels. Mr. Popo Popo's one saving grace is that he's an auxiliary character, so you can mostly ignore his presence in the universe, but it doesn't change the fact that he's obviously based on American minstrels, which, for those who don't know, were used very directly as a way of ridiculing African Americans and entirely cornering the market on black representation, which is precisely why, although painting your face black on its own may not be explicitly harmful, it does have a historical context that leads me to believe anyone who claims to not be aware of the meaning of that behavior is full of shit. But like many foreign problems facing Americans these days, the call may be coming from inside the house. As offensive as Japanese portrayals of black Americans may be, I'm willing to accept that they don't all understand the full scope of how hurtful blackface and minstrelsy can be to black people in the US, because Japan, and certainly pre-Obama and pre-Twitter shame Japan, is a very homogenous country that doesn't have the particular racial history that the United States has, although it does have some of its own. And that is not to suggest that being unaware of a people's continued disrespect is an excuse for perpetuating that disrespect, but it is to suggest that the only massive scale interaction the Japanese have had with black Americans, aside from Bow Wow and Tokyo Drift, came directly from Americans themselves. And it was obviously not in the form of black Americans personally making a case for our humanity, because, you know, we've been busy. If you were somehow not aware, America's been both hugely racist and hugely influential for a long time. You'd be hard-pressed to find a country whose media landscape has not been swayed in some way by American influence. And just to add perspective, for all the culture that has been spearheaded by African Americans, rap music just overtook rock and roll as America's biggest musical export like 2 years ago. Also a black genre, but that's another video. So that is all to say that the world's concept of black Americans, even in Africa to some degree, has been through a white American lens. And you can trace that almost entirely back to America's own entertainment industry. Just look at Hollywood. The first 12-reel film to show in America was Birth of a Nation, a wildly racist movie that presented black men as sexually aggressive animals and the Ku Klux Klan as heroes protecting white women from bad black monsters. Now, I don't want to focus on that too much, but here's a scene where Bulma, with very Kelly Kapowski hair, meets Mr. Popo for the first time and says that he creeps her out despite the fact that Goku literally stole her underwear in her sleep a few years before. Again, that's another video.
What's the matter?
Hey, you really trust this guy? He's just got sort of a creepy look in his eyes.
The point is, Japanese media has taken plenty of notes from American movies and cartoons, the first manga and anime being inspired by characters like Mickey Mouse. For perspective, I just found out that the white gloves Mickey wears, although they do make it easier to contrast his hands against his body, were also inspired by the gloves they wear in minstrel shows. And if you didn't already know that, now you do. And if you're like me, you're gonna tell white people about it when they've done nothing to you. Aside from that, blackface and other negative racial stereotypes were so prevalent that half of Disney's catalog is in the vault permanently, and episodes of Tom and Jerry now come with a disclaimer about how editing old episodes to remove racist material would be doing a disservice and blah 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 blah. I once went to a party where they were showing an old episode of Betty Boop where she goes to Africa, which I think is enough information, and as she and an older male friend were running from a hail of spears, I asked if I was the only person bothered by it, and a white woman said yes, but that's a personal thing. Point being, American media worldwide basically did exactly what it set out to do, which was to ridicule African Americans and effectively establish whites as a superior race without making a whole thing about it. Germany. Of course, with all this input from white people pretending to be black and not much competing dialogue, it stands to reason that even if they didn't believe this is what black people were like, the Japanese could have at the very least thought that this is just how you portray black people. You know, you gotta use Final Draft and you gotta draw big pink lips. So again, I'm willing to accept that at Dragon Ball's inception, maybe they just didn't grasp the full scope of the racism in that depiction. But even if that's true, it doesn't mean Kill la Kill, Officer Black, and particularly Mr. Popo are not racist. It just means the power of American media is such that it can dilute inflammatory imagery and messaging into something that seems fun and cute. Just look at the original lyrics of any nursery rhyme and tell me I'm wrong. So now, let's revisit RZA's statement that Dragon Ball Z is the story of black men in America. When Z begins, we find out Goku, who was sent to Earth as a baby and had his memory wiped by a bump on the head, is a Saiyan, a member of a proud alien race, the strongest warriors in the universe, who were conquered by and now do the bidding of the ultra-powerful, despite never working a day in his life, Lord Frieza. This holds obvious parallels between American slaves and a very general construct of whiteness in America. Frieza even goes as far as to openly espouse his hatred for Saiyans and call them monkeys, which is a common racial slur popularized by H&M. And it makes sense since Saiyans do have tails that allow them to literally turn into powerful and uncontrollable great apes. Now, this all seems very straightforward. A man is taken from his home, forgets his history, and finds out his people were once proud warriors, now enslaved by a maniac. Maybe they're not slaves, I don't know. Maybe Cooler took so long to show up because he was handling payroll. I don't know these things. But what I do know is that so far this theory appears sound. It gets a little more complicated though when you consider that as the story moves on, every Saiyan either dies or has his tail removed. And later into the series we see new Saiyans being introduced that don't have tails to begin with. Now, just like depictions of black men may have been unintentionally insensitive, the idea of removing tails and thus the ability to take the great ape form and thus effectively civilizing Saiyans and making them more permanently human may be an unintentional commentary on attempts to civilize and westernized Africans. But then there's more. We all know by now that Goku later goes on to defeat Frieza on planet Namek after he goes Super Saiyan for the first time. If you didn't know that, you've had like 20 years. I feel nothing. A Saiyan gets really mad and then his strength increases anywhere from 2 to 100 times depending on who you ask and in what language, and in this form his hair turns blonde and his eyes turn blue and he gets deals modeling for Hugo Boss and starring in Volkswagen commercials. Okay, obviously my point is that Super Saiyans are basically atomic Aryans, and no, I'm not saying alien in a super racist way, I'm talking about Hitler's dream children. Anyway, it's been suggested before that a blonde-haired, blue-eyed fighting machine being the highest state a person can achieve is pretty racist, or at the very least pretty short-sighted. Speaking of which, maybe somebody needs to look into the etymology of Blue Eyes White Dragon. My point is that regardless of intent, it is true that with inherent anti-blackness, there usually comes inherent pro-whiteness, and I think Goku's arc from meeting his older brother Raditz to avenging Krillin on a dying planet Namek is indicative of that dynamic. So once again, I agree with Riza, but only partially. I believe DBZ, particularly the Saiyan Saga, is the story of black men in America, and it was probably intended to be a positive take on it. But from where I'm standing, it looks to me more like the story of a handful of black men, the ones who reach a level of power or success that allows them the luxury of being more than just their race. Once Goku achieves the state of Super Saiyan, he's exactly that, superior to Saiyans. He's a figure that for the past 1,000 years has just been hearsay, a legend. He transcends race. With that, I assert that the story of Dragon Ball Z is not just the story of black men in America, it's the story of Kanye West, of O.J. Simpson, of Muhammad Ali. It's the story of black men who become so big that they then have to make a choice. The choice to allow the world's perception of you to affect your perception of yourself. Kanye did it, OJ did it. Of these 3 examples, Ali is the one who continued to understand that his blackness and the blackness of others persists regardless of his personal wealth or accomplishments. Of course, anyone who watches Dragon Ball Z knows that Goku does not abandon Saiyans altogether, but rather brings them up with him, eventually opening the door for all the other living Saiyans to at least reach Super Saiyan 2. We can talk about how Goten and Trunks reaching the state as kids is a commentary on generational wealth, but once again, that's another video. So how do you reconcile these racial dynamics all occurring within the same story? And how, as black Dragon Ball Z fans, do we move beyond its deep-seated biases and just enjoy the show for everything else that it is? How do we move past the minstrelsy and the calls to essentially shed our so-called savagery in favor of Western ideals, assuming you accept that this is a black story? Well, you know that thing you feel every time Kanye speaks? That's called cognitive dissonance, and it's what keeps black people going. It's like Gatorade for your brain. Sure, everything you love is bad, but what if it was good? And sometimes it's as simple as that. In all seriousness, I believe the racial pitfalls in Dragon Ball are certainly indicative of 1, a lack of understanding and empathy on the part of its creators, and 2, a possibly unconscious subscription to some white supremacist ideals. But overall, you have to look at its real-world impact on its fans. In a pre-Black Panther and even pre-Static Shock era, when there weren't that many black heroes to look up to, we often turned to imperfect ones who reflected at least a version of our own stories. This was true of other series like X-Men, which similarly is based on the civil rights movement, but will almost certainly have as many blind spots if you look closely enough. To be honest, I learned what a Saiyan was probably years before I learned what an Aryan was, so maybe we should revisit this conversation with the American education system in mind. As kids, I think we all looked at Goku as embodying something about ourselves, our struggle, our loss, and our untapped potential. And I think having that and being able to share it with other black kids and believing we were all unified in this one way was more valuable to me than the historical implications at play. I'm Yedoye. Thanks for watching Getting the Robot, your anime explainer. Piccolo is black, by the way.